Osho, The Art of Dying, Talks on Hasidism, given at the Osho Commune International, Pune, India. Discourse number 1.
Bhagwan, when Rabbi Burnham lay dying, his wife burst into tears. He said, "What are you crying for? My whole life was only that I might learn how to die."
Life is in living. It is not a thing. It is a process. There is no way to attain to life except by living it, except being alive, flowing, streaming with it. If you are seeking the meaning of life in some dogma, in some philosophy, in some theology, that is the sure way to miss life and meaning both. A life is not somewhere waiting for you. It is happening in you. It is not in future as a goal to be arrived. It is here now, this very moment, in your breathing, circulating in your blood, beating in your heart. Whatsoever you are is your life. And if you start seeking meaning somewhere else, you will miss it. And man has done that for centuries. Concepts have become very important. Explanations have become very important. And the real is completely forgotten. We don't look to that which is already here. We want rationalizations. I have heard a very beautiful story. Some years ago, a successful American had a serious identity crisis. He sought help from psychiatrists, but nothing came of it, for there was none who could tell him the meaning of life, which is what he wanted to know. By and by he learned of a venerable and incredibly wise guru who lived in a mysterious and most inaccessible region of the Himalayas. Only that guru, he came to believe, would tell him what life means and what his role in it ought to be. So he sold all his worldly possessions and began his search for the all-knowing guru. He spent 8 years wandering from village to village throughout the Himalayas in an effort to find him. And then one day he chanced upon a shepherd who told him where the guru lived and how to reach the place. It took him almost a year to find him, but he eventually did. There he came upon his guru, who was indeed venerable, in fact, well over 100 years old. The guru consented to help him, especially when he learned of all the sacrifices the man made towards this end. "What can I do for you, my son?" asked the guru. "I need to know the meaning of life," said the man. To this the guru replied without hesitation, "Life," he said, "is a river without end." "A river without end?" said the man in a startled surprise. "After coming all this way to find you, All you have to tell me is that life is a river without end. The Guru was shaken, shocked. He became very angry and he said, "You mean it is not?" Nobody can give you the meaning of your life. It is your life. The meaning has also to be yours. Himalayas won't help. Nobody except you can come upon it. It is your life, and it is only accessible to you. Only in living the mystery will be revealed to you. The first thing I would like to tell you is, don't seek it anywhere else. Don't seek it in me. Don't seek it in scriptures. Don't seek in clever explanations. They all explain away. They don't explain. They simply stuff your empty mind. They don't make you aware of what is. And the more the mind is stuffed with dead knowledge, the more dull and stupid you become. Knowledge makes people stupid. It dulls their sensitivity. It stuffs them. It becomes a weight on them. It strengthens their ego, but it does not give light, and it does not show you the way. It is not possible. Life is already there, bubbling within you. It can be contacted only there. The temple is not outside. You are the shrine of it. So the first thing to remember, if you want to know what life is, never seek it without. Never try to find out from somebody else. The meaning cannot be transferred that way. And the greatest masters have never said anything about life. They have always thrown you back to yourself. The second thing to remember, once you know what life is, you will know what death is. Because death is also the part of the same process. Ordinarily we think death comes at the end. Ordinarily we think death is against life. Ordinarily we think death is the enemy. Death is not the enemy. And if you think death as the enemy, it simply shows you have not been able to know what life is. Death and life are two polarities of the same energy, of the same phenomenon. The tide and the ebb, the day and the night, the summer and winter, they are not separate and not opposites, not contraries, they are complementaries. Death is not the end of life. In fact, it is a completion of one life. The crescendo of one life. The climax, the final. But once you know your life and its process, then you understand what death is. Death is an organic, integral part of life. And it is very friendly to life. Without it, life cannot exist. It exists because of death. Death gives the background. Death is in fact a process of renewal. And death also happens each moment as life happens, because the renewal is needed each moment. The moment you breathe in and the moment you breathe out, both are happening. Breathing in, life happens. Breathing out, death happens. That's why when a child is born, the first thing he is going to do is to breathe in. Then life starts. And the last thing, when an old man is dying, will be he breathes out. Life departs. Breathing out is death, breathing in is life. And both are like two wheels of a bullock cart. You live by breathing in as much as you live by breathing out. The breathing out is part of breathing in. You cannot breathe in if you stop breathing out. You cannot live if you stop dying. The man who has understood what his life is allows death to happen. He welcomes. He dies each moment, and each moment he is resurrected. His cross and his resurrection are continuously happening as a process. He dies to the past each moment, and he is again and again born into the future. If you look into life, you will be able to know what death is. If you understand what death is, only then you are able to understand what life is. They are organic. Ordinarily, out of fear, we have created a division. We think life is good, death is bad. We think life has to be desired and death to be avoided. We think somehow we have to protect ourselves against death. This absurd idea creates endless miseries in your life. Because a person who protects himself against death becomes incapable of living. He is the person who is afraid of exhaling. Then he cannot inhale. Then he is stuck. Then he simply drags. His life is no more a flow. His life is no more a river. If you really want to live, you have to be ready to die. Who is afraid of death in you? Life is afraid of death? It is not possible. How life can be afraid of its own integral process? Something else is afraid in you. The ego is afraid in you. Life and death are not opposites. Ego and death are opposites. Life and death are not opposites. Ego and life are opposites. Ego is against both life and death. The ego is afraid to live. The ego is afraid to die. It is afraid to live because each effort, each step towards life brings death closer. If you live, you are coming closer to die. The ego is afraid to die, hence it is afraid to live also. The ego simply drags. There are many people who are neither alive nor dead. This is worse than anything. A man who is fully alive is full of death also. That is the meaning of Jesus on cross. it has not been really understood. Jesus carrying his own cross. And he says to his disciples, you will have to carry your own cross. The meaning of Jesus carrying his own cross is nothing but this, very simple. That everybody has to carry his death continuously. And everybody has to die each moment. Everybody has to be on the cross, because that is the only way to live fully, totally. Whenever you come to a total moment of aliveness, suddenly you will see death also there. In love it happens. In love, life comes to a climax. And hence people are afraid of love. I have been continuously surprised by people who come to me and say they are afraid of love. What is the fear of love? Because when you really love somebody, your ego starts slipping and melting. You cannot love with the ego. The ego becomes a barrier. And you would like to drop the barrier. And the ego says, this is going to be a death. Beware. The death of the ego is not your death. The death of the ego is really your possibility to live. The ego is just a dead crust around you. It has to be broken and thrown away. It naturally comes into being. Just as a traveler passes, dust collects on his clothes, on his body. And he has to take a bath to get rid of the dust. As we move in time, dust collects of experiences, of knowledge, of lived life, of past. That dust becomes our ego. Accumulated, it becomes a crust around you. It has to be broken and thrown away. One has to take a bath continuously, every day, in fact every moment, so that this crust never becomes a prison. The ego is afraid to love, because in love life comes to a peak. But whenever there is a peak of life, there is also a peak of death. They go together. In love, you die and you are reborn. The same happens when you come to meditate or to pray, or when you come to a master to surrender. The ego creates all sorts of difficulties, rationalizations, not to surrender. Think about it, brood about it, be clever about it. When you come to a master again, the ego becomes suspicious, doubtful, creates anxiety. Again you are coming to life, to a flame, where death will also be as much alive as life. Let it be remembered that death and life both become a flame together. They are never separate. If you are very, very minimally alive, at the minimum, then you can see death and life separate. The closer you come to the peak, they start coming closer. At the very apex, they meet and become one. In love, in meditation, in trust, in prayer, wherever life becomes total, death is there. Without death, life cannot become total. But the ego always thinks in divisions, in dualities. It divides everything. Existence is indivisible. It cannot be divided. You were a child. then you became young? Can you demark the line when you became young? Can you demark the point in time where suddenly you were no more a child and you became young? One day you become old. Can you demark the line when you became old? Processes cannot be demarked. Exactly the same happens when you are born. Can you demark when you are born? When life really starts? Does it start when the child starts breathing? And the doctor spanks the child and the child starts breathing. Then life is born? Or when the child got into the womb, the mother became pregnant, the child was conceived, then life started. Or even before that, when life exactly starts, it is a non-ending and a process of no beginning. It never starts. When a person is dead, when the breathing stops, then a person is dead. Many yogis have proved it now on scientific grounds that they can stop breathing and they are still alive and they can come back. So stopping of the breathing cannot be the end. Where life ends, it never ends anywhere. It never begins anywhere. We are involved in eternity. We have been here since the very beginning, if there was any beginning. And we will be here. We are going to be here to the very end, if there is going to be any end. In fact, there cannot be any beginning and there cannot be any end. We are life. Forms change. Bodies change. Minds change. And what we call life is just an identification with a certain body, with a certain mind, with a certain attitude. What we call death is nothing but getting out of that form, out of that body, out of that concept. You change houses. If you get too much identified with one house, then changing the house will be very painful. You will think you are dying. Because the old house was what you were. That was your identity. But it doesn't happen because you know you are only changing the house, you remain the same. Those who have looked within themselves, those who have found who they are, come to know an eternal, non-ending process. Life is a process, timeless, beyond time. Death is part of it. Death is a continuous revival, a help to life to resurrect again and again, to help the life to get rid of old forms, to get rid of dilapidated buildings, to get rid of old confining structures, so that again you can flow, and again you can become fresh and young, and again you can become virgin. I have heard a man was browsing through an antique shop near Mount Vernon and ran across a rather ancient looking axe. "That's a mighty old axe you have there," he said to the shop owner. "Yes," said the man, "it once belonged to George Washington." "Really?" said the customer. It certainly stood up well. Of course, said the antique dealer, it has had 3 new handles and 2 new heads. But that's how life is. It goes on changing handles and heads. In fact, it seems everything goes on changing, and yet something remains eternally the same. Just watch. You were a child. What has remained of that now? Just a memory. Your body has changed. Your mind has changed. Your identity has changed. What has remained of your childhood? Nothing has remained, just a memory. You cannot even make a distinction whether really it had happened or you had seen a dream. Or you had read in a book, or somebody has told about himself, whether the childhood was yours or somebody else. Sometimes have a look into the album of old photographs. Just see this was you, and you will not be able to believe. You have changed so much. In fact, everything has changed. Handles and heads and everything has changed. And still, deep down somewhere, something remains a continuity. A witnessing remains continuous. There is a thread, howsoever invisible. Everything goes on changing. That invisible thread remains the same. That thread is beyond life and death. Life and death are 2 wings for that which is beyond life and death. That which is beyond goes on using life and death as 2 wheels of a car, complementary. It lives through life, it lives through death. Death and life are its processes, like inhalation, exhalation. But something in you is transcendental. That art thou, that transcendental. But we are too much identified with the form that creates the ego. That's what we call I. Of course, the I has to die many times, and it has to die many times. It is constantly in fear, trembling, shaking, always afraid, protecting, securing. A Sufi mystic knocked at the door of a very rich man. He was a beggar, and he wanted nothing but enough so that he can have his meal. The rich man shouted at him and said, "Nobody knows you here, but I know myself," said the dervish. How sad it would be if the reverse were true. If everybody knew me and I was not aware who I am, how sad it would have been. Yes, you are right, nobody knows me here, but I know myself. These are only the 2 situations possible. And you are in the sad situation. Everybody may be knowing about you. who you are. You yourself are completely oblivious of your transcendence, of your real nature, of your authentic being. This is the only sadness in life. You can find many excuses, but the real sadness is this, that you don't know who you are. How a person can be happy not knowing who he is, not knowing from where he is coming, not knowing where he is going. And then 1,001 problems arise because of this basic self-ignorance. A bunch of ants came out of the darkness of their underground nests in search of food. It was early in the morning. The ants happened to pass by a plant whose leaves were covered with morning dew. "What are these?" asked one of the ants, pointing to the dewdrops. "Where do they come from?" Some said they come from the earth. Others said they come from the sea. Soon a quarrel broke out. There was a group who adhered to the sea theory and a group who attached themselves to the earth theory. Only one, a wise and intelligent ant, stood alone. He said, "Let us pause a moment and look around for signs, for everything has an attraction towards its source, or, as it is said, everything returns to its origin. No matter how far in the air you throw a piece of brick, it comes down to the earth. Whatever leans towards the light must originally be of the light." The ants were not totally convinced yet and were about to resume their dispute, but the sun had come up and the dewdrops were leaving the leaves, rising towards the sun and disappearing into the sun. Everything returns to its original source. Has to return to its original source. If you understand life, then you understand death also. Life is a forgetfulness of the original source, and death is again a remembrance. Life is going away from the original source, death is coming back home. Death is not ugly, death is beautiful. But death is beautiful only for those who have lived their life unhindered, uninhibited, unsuppressed. Death is beautiful only for those who have lived their life beautifully, who have not been afraid to live, who have been courageous to live, who loved, who danced, who celebrated. Death becomes the ultimate celebration if your life is a celebration. Let me tell you in this way, whatsoever your life is, death reveals only that. If you have been miserable in life, death reveals misery. Death is a great revealer. If you've been happy in your life, death reveals happiness. If you have lived only a life of physical comfort and physical pleasure, then of course death is going to be very uncomfortable and unpleasant, because the body has to be left. Body is just a temporary abode, a sarai in which we stay for the overnight, and in the morning we have to leave. It is not your permanent abode. It is not your home. So if you have lived just a bodily life and you have never known anything beyond the body, death is going to be very, very ugly, unpleasant, painful. death is going to be an anguish. But if you have lived a little higher than the body, if you have loved music and poetry, and you have loved, and you have looked at the flowers and the stars, and something of the non-physical has entered into your consciousness, that will not be so bad. That will not be so painful. You can take it with equanimity. But still it cannot be a celebration. If you have lived something into the transcendental in yourself, if you have entered your own nothingness at the center of your being, where you are no more a body and no more a mind, where physical pleasures are completely left far away, and mental pleasures also, the pleasures of music and poetry and literature and painting, everything is left far away. You are simply just pure awareness, consciousness. Then death is going to be a great celebration, a great understanding, a great revelation. If you have known anything, the transcendental in you, death will reveal you the transcendental in the universe. Then death is more a death, but a meeting with God, a date with God. So you can find three expressions about death in the history of human mind. One expression is of the ordinary man who lives attached to his body, who has never known anything than the pleasure of food or sex, whose whole life has been nothing but food and sex, who has enjoyed sex, whose life has been very primitive, whose life has been very gross, who has lived it, and who has then the moment of fight death, all the society is dead dark, village. They is very ugly buffalo, which people missed. Able to touch, to fly to the height. And there is this suffer sometimes that death is nothing. I have known something, food and sex. Life has not been reproducing. They are little more. Death is, one goes into. But they too are. Those not only a rest, door opens. His disciples, fully radiant, and his around him. As he tells us it, he opened his heart, Isabel, goodbye. Became full of light, disappears. When a person has God, remember, liberation for this burst into tears. My religion is not you how to live. If you know how to live, let me tell you a few things. First, your life is your life. It is nobody else. So don't allow to be dominated by others. Don't allow yourself to be dictated by others. It is a betrayal of life. If you allow yourself to be dictated by others, maybe your parents, your society, your educational system, your politicians, your peace, whosoever they are, if you allow yourself to be dominated by others, you will miss your life. Because the domination comes from outside and life is within you. They never meet. I am not saying that you become a no-sayer to each and everything. That too is not of much help. There are two types of people. One, very obedient type. ready to surrender to any and everybody. They don't have any independent soul in them. Immature, childish, always searching for a father figure, somebody to say to them what to do and what not to do. Not able to trust their own being. These people are the greater part of the world, the masses. Then there are against these people a small minority who reject society, who reject the values of the society. And they think they are rebellious. They are not. They are only reactionaries. Because whether you listen to the society or you reject to the society, if society remains in either way the determining factor, then you are dominated by the society. Let me tell you one anecdote. Once Mullah Nasruddin had been away for a while and arrived back in town wearing a long beard. His friends naturally kidded him about the beard and asked him how he happened to acquire the fur piece. The mullah with the beard began to complain and curse the thing in no uncertain terms. His friends were amazed at the way he talked and asked him why he continued to wear the beard if he did not like it. I hate the blasted thing, the mullah told them. If you hate it, then why don't you shave it off and get rid of it? One of his friends asked. A devilish gleam shone in the eyes of the mullah as he answered, because my wife hates it too. But that does not make you free. The hippies, the yippies and others, they are not really rebellious people. They are reactionaries. They have reacted against the society. Few are obedient, they are disobedient. But the center of domination is the same. Few obey, few disobey. But nobody looks at his own soul. A real rebellious person is one who is neither for society nor against society, who simply lives his life according to his own understanding. Whether it goes against society or it goes with society is not a consideration. It is irrelevant. Sometimes it may go with the society, sometimes it may not go with the society. But that is not the point to be considered. He lives according to his understanding, according to his small light. And I am not saying that he becomes very egoistic about it. No, he is very humble. He knows that his light is very small, but that is all the light that there is. He knows that I may be wrong. He is not adamant. He is very humble. He says, I may be wrong, but please allow me to be wrong according to myself. That is the only way to learn. To commit mistakes is the only way to learn. To move according to one's own understanding is the only way to grow and become mature. If you are always looking at somebody to dictate, whether you obey or disobey makes no difference. If you are looking somebody else to dictate and then you will decide for or against, you will never be able to know what your life is. It has to be lived. And you have to follow your own small light. it is not always certain what to do. You are much confused. Let it be so. But find out a way out of your confusion. It is very cheap and easy to listen to others because they can hand over you dead dogmas. They can give you commandments. Do this, don't do that. And they are very certain about their commandments. Certainty should not be sought. Understanding. If you are seeking certainty, you will become a victim of some trap or other. Don't seek certainty. Seek understanding. Certainty can be given to you cheap. Anybody can give it to you. But in the final analysis, you will be a loser. You lost your life just to remain secure and certain. And life is not certain. And life is not secure. Life is insecurity. Each moment is a move into more and more insecurity. It is a gamble. One never knows what is going to happen. And it is beautiful that one never knows. If it was predictable, life would not be worth living. If it was, everything was as you would like, and everything was certain, you will not be a man at all, you will be a machine. Only for machines, everything is secure and certain. Man lives in freedom. Freedom needs insecurity and uncertainty. A real man of intelligence is always hesitant, because he has no dogma to rely upon, to lean upon. He has to look and respond. Lao Tzu says that I am hesitant. And I move in life alert. Because I don't know what is going to happen. And I don't have any principle to follow. I have to decide every moment. I never decide beforehand. I have to decide when the moment has come. Then one has to be very responsive. That's what responsibility is. Responsibility is not an obligation. Responsibility is not a duty. It is a capacity to respond. A man who wants to know what life is has to be responsive. That is missing. Centuries of conditioning have made you more like machines. You have lost your manhood. You have bargained for security. You are secure and comfortable, and everything has been planned by others, and they have put everything on the map. They have measured everything. This is all absolutely foolish, because life cannot be measured. It is immeasurable. And no map is possible, because it is in constant flux. Everything goes on changing. Except change, nothing is permanent. Says Heraclitus, you cannot step in the same river twice. And the ways of life are very zigzag. The way of life is not like a track of a railway train. No, it does not run on tracks. And that's the beauty of it, the glory of it, the poetry of it, the music of it, that it is always a surprise. If you are seeking for security, certainty, your eyes will become closed, and you will be less and less surprised, and you will lose the capacity to wonder. Once you lose the capacity to wonder, you have lost a religion. A religion is the opening of your wondering heart. Religion is a receptivity for the mysterious that surrounds us. Don't seek security. Don't seek advice how to live your life. People come to me, they say, Bhagwan, say to us how we should live our lives. You are not interested in knowing what life is. You are more interested to make a fixed pattern. You are more interested to kill life than to live it. You want a discipline to be imposed on you. And there are, of course, priests and politicians all over the world who are ready, just sitting for you. Come to them and they are ready to impose their disciplines on you. They enjoy that power that comes through imposing your own ideas upon others. I'm not here for that. I'm here to help you to become free. And when I say I'm here to help you to become free, I'm included. I'm to help you to become free of me also. My sannyas is a very paradoxical thing. You surrender to me in order to become free. I accept you and initiate you into sannyas to help you to become absolutely free of every dogma, of every scripture, of every philosophy. And I am included in it. Sannyas is as paradoxical, should be, as life itself is. Then it is alive. So the first thing, don't ask anybody how you should live your life. Life is so precious. Live it. I am not saying that you will not commit mistakes. You will commit. Remember only one thing, don't commit the same mistakes again and again. That's enough. If you can find a new mistake every day, commit it. But don't repeat mistakes. But that is foolish. A man who can find new mistakes to commit will be growing continuously. And that is the only way to learn. That is the only way to come to your own inner light. I have heard it is said, one night the poet Avadi of Kerman was sitting on his porch, a very great Muslim poet, bent over a vessel. Shams-e-Tabrizi, a great Sufi mystic, happened to pass by. Shams-e-Tabrizi looked at the poet, what he is doing. He asked the poet, what are you doing? The poet said, contemplating the moon in a bowl of water. Shams-e-Tabrizi started laughing, a uproarious laughter, a mad laughter. The poet started feeling uncomfortable. A crowd gathers. And the poet says, what is the matter? Why are you laughing so much? Why you are ridiculing me? Shams-e-Tabrizi said, unless you have broken your neck, why don't you look at the moon in the sky directly? The moon is there, the full moon is there. And this poet is sitting with a bowl of water and looking into the bowl of the water at the reflection of the moon. Seeking truth in scriptures, seeking truth in philosophies is looking at the reflection. If you ask somebody else how you should live your life, you are asking for misguidance. Because that man can only say about his own life. And never, never two lives are the same. Whatsoever he can say and impart to you will be about his own life. And that too only if he has lived. He may have asked somebody else. He may have followed somebody else. He may have been an imitator himself. Then reflection of the reflection. And centuries pass. And people go on reflecting the reflection and the reflection and the reflection. And the real moon is always there in the sky waiting for you. It is your moon. It is your sky. Look directly. Be immediate about it. Why borrow my eyes or anybody else's eyes? You have been given eyes, beautiful eyes, to see and to see directly. Why borrow understanding from anybody? Remember, it may be understanding to me. The moment you borrow, it becomes knowledge to you. It is no more understanding. Understanding is only that which has been experienced by the person himself. It may be understanding for me if I have looked at the moon. But the moment I say it to you, it becomes knowledge. It is no more understanding. Then it is just verbal. Then it is just linguistic. And language is a lie. Let me tell you one anecdote. A chicken farmer, dissatisfied with the productivity of his flock, decided to use a bit of psychology on his hens. Accordingly, he purchased a gay-colored talking parrot and placed him in the barnyard. Sure enough, the hens took to the handsome stranger immediately, pointed out the best tidbits for him to eat with joyous clucks, and generally followed him around like a bevy of teenage girls following a new singing star sensation. To the delight of the farmer, even their egg-laying capabilities improved. The barnyard rooster, naturally jealous of being ignored by his harem, set upon the attractive interloper, assailed him with beak and claws, pulling out one green or red feather after the other, whereupon the intimidated parrot cried out in trepidation, "Desist, sir, I beg of you, desist. After all, I am only here in the capacity of a language professor." Many people live their life as language professors. That is the falsest kind of life. Reality needs no language. It is available to you on a non-verbal level. The moon is there. It needs no bowl and no water. It needs no other medium. You have just to look at it. It is a non-verbal communication. The whole life is available. Just you have to learn how to communicate with it non-verbally. That's what meditation is all about. To be in such a space where language does not interfere, where learned concepts don't come in between you and the real. When you love a woman, don't be bothered what others have said about love. That is going to be an interference. You love the woman, the love is there. Forget all that you have learnt about love. Forget all Kinseys and forget all Masters and Johnsons. Forget all Freuds and Jungs. Please don't become a language professor. Just love the woman and let love be there and let love lead you and guide you into its innermost secrets, into its mysteries. Then you will be able to know what love is. What others say about meditation is meaningless. Once I came upon a book. A Jaina saint has written that book about meditation. It was really beautiful. Just few places were there where I could see that the man has never meditated himself. Otherwise those places cannot be there. But they were very few and far in between. The whole book, on the whole, almost 99% was perfect. I loved the book. Then I forgot the book. For 10 years I was wandering around the country. Once, in a village of Rajasthan, that saint came to meet me. His name looked familiar, and suddenly I remembered the book. And I asked the saint, why you have come to me? He said, I have come to you to know what meditation is. I said, I remember your book, and I remember it very well, because it has really impressed me, except few defects which showed that you have never meditated. The book was perfectly right, 99% right. And now you come here to learn about meditation. Have you never meditated? He looked a little embarrassed because his disciples were also there. I said, be frank. Because if you say you know meditation, that I'm not going to talk about it, then finish. You know. There is no need. If you say to me frankly, at least be true once. If you say you have never meditated, only then I can help you towards meditation. It was a bargain, so he has to confess. He said, yes. I have never said it to anybody. I have read many books about meditation, all the old scriptures. And I have been teaching to people, that's why I feel embarrassed before my disciples. I have been teaching meditations to thousands, and I have written books about it, but I have never meditated. Now, you can write books about meditation, never coming across the space what meditation is. You can become so efficient in verbalizing. You can become so clever in abstraction, in intellectual argumentativeness, and you can forget completely that all the time that you have been involved in these intellectual activities is a sheer wastage. I asked the old man, how long you have been interested in meditation? He said, my whole life. He was almost 70. He said, when I was 20, I took sannyas. I became a Jaina monk. And those 50 years since then, I have been reading and thinking about meditation. 50 years thinking and reading and writing about meditation. Even guiding people into meditations. And he has not even tasted once what meditation is. And this is the case with millions of people. They talk about love. They know all the poetries about love. But they have never loved. Or even if they thought they were in love, they were never in love. That was too a heady thing. It was not of the heart. People live and go on missing life. It needs courage. It needs courage to be realistic. It needs courage to move with the life wherever it leads. The paths are uncharted. There exists no map. One has to go into the unknown. Life can be understood only if you are ready to go into the unknown. If you cling to the known, you cling to the mind, and mind is not life. Life is non-mental, non-intellectual, because life is total. Your totality has to be involved in it. You cannot just think about it. Thinking about life is not life. Beware of this aboutism. One goes on thinking about. There are people who think about God. There are people who think about life. People who think about love. People who think about this and that. Mullah Nasruddin became very old and he went to his doctor. And he was looking very weak. And the doctor said, I can say only one thing. You will have to cut your love life to half. The mullah said, okay. Which half? Talking about it or thinking about it? That's all. Don't become a language professor. Don't become a parrot. Parrots are language professors. They live in words, concepts, theories, theologies. And life goes on passing, is slipping out of the hands. Then one day suddenly they become afraid of death. When a person is afraid of death, know well that person has missed life. If he had not missed life, there cannot be any fear of death. If a person has lived life, he will be ready to live death also. He will be almost enchanted by the phenomenon of death. When Socrates was dying, he was so enchanted that his disciples could not believe that what he is feeling so happy about. One disciple, Crato, asked, why you are looking so happy? We are crying and weeping. Socrates says, why should not I be happy? I have known what life is. Now I would like to know what death is. I am at the door of a great mystery. And I am thrilled. I am going on a great journey of the unknown. I am simply full of wonder. I cannot wait. And remember, Socrates was not a religious man. Socrates was not in any way a believer. Somebody asked, are you so certain that the soul will survive after death? Socrates says, I don't know. To say I don't know is the greatest courage in the world. It is very difficult. Difficult for the language professors to say I don't know. Difficult for the parrots. A very sincere and honest man. Socrates says, I don't know. But then the disciple asked, then why you are feeling so happy? If the soul does not survive, then Socrates, I have to see. If I survive, there is no fear about it then. If I don't survive, how can there be fear? If I don't survive, then where is the fear? There is nobody there. So fear cannot exist. If I survive, I survive. There is no point in getting afraid about it. But I don't know exactly what is going to happen. That's why I am so much full of wonders and ready to go into it. I don't know. To me, this is what a religious man should be. A religious man is not a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Mohammedan. Because all these are ways of knowledge. A Christian says, I know, and his knowledge comes from the Christian dogmas. A Hindu says, I also know, and his knowledge comes from the Vedas and the Gitas and his dogmas. And a Hindu is against the Christian because he says, if I am right, you cannot be right. If you are right, then I cannot be right. So there is great argument and there is much dispute and much debate and unnecessary conflict. A religious man, a really religious man, not the so-called religious people, is one who says, I don't know. When you say, I don't know, you are open. You are ready to learn. When you say, I don't know, you don't have any prejudice, this way or that. You don't have any belief. You don't have any knowledge. You have only awareness. You say, I am aware, and whatsoever happens, I will see. I will not carry any dogma from the past. This is the attitude of a disciple. The attitude of one who wants to learn. And discipline simply means learning. A disciple means a learner, and discipline means learning. One who is ready to learn. Here I am not to teach you any dogmas. I am not imparting any knowledge to you. I am simply helping you to see that which is. Live your life. Whatsoever the cost, be ready to gamble with it. I have heard about a businessman he was walking from his office to a restaurant for lunch when he was stopped by a stranger who said to him, I don't think that you remember me, but 10 years ago I came to this city broke. I asked you for a loan and you gave me $20 because you said you were willing to take a chance to start a man on the road to success. The businessman thought for a while and then he said, yes, I remember the incident. Go on with your story. Well, remarked the stranger, are you still willing to gamble? Life asks you the same question again and again and again. Are you still willing to gamble? It is never certain. Life has no insurance in it. It's simply an opening, a wild opening, a chaotic opening. You can make a small house around you secure, but then that will prove your grave. Live with life. And we have been doing that in many ways. Marriage is man created. Love is part of life. When you create marriage around love, you are creating security. You are making something which cannot be made. Love cannot be made legal. You are trying to do the impossible. And if in that effort love dies, there is no wonder. You become a husband, your beloved becomes a wife, you are no more two alive persons. You are two functionaries. The husband has a certain function, the wife has a certain function to do. They have certain duties to fulfill. Life has ceased flowing. They are frozen. Watch a husband and wife. You will always see two persons frozen, sitting side by side, not knowing what they are doing here, why they are sitting. Maybe they have nowhere to go. When you see love between two persons, something is flowing, moving, changing. When there is love between two persons, they live in an aura. There is a constant sharing. Their vibrations are reaching to each other. They are broadcasting their being to each other. There is no wall between them. They are two and yet not two. They are one also. The husband and wife are as far away as it is possible to be. They may be sitting by the side to each other. The husband never listens what the wife is saying. He has become deaf long ago. The wife never sees what is happening to the husband. She has become blind to him. They take each other absolutely granted. They have become things. They are no more persons. Persons are always open. And persons are always uncertain. And persons are always changing. Now they have a fixed role to fulfill. They died the day they got married. Since that day they have not lived. I'm not saying don't get married. But remember it. That love is the real thing. And if it dies, then marriage is worthless. And the same is true about everything in life. About everything. Either you can live it, but then you have to live with this hesitation, not knowing what is going to happen the next moment, or you can make everything certain about it. There are people who have become so certain about everything, they are never surprised. There are people you cannot surprise them. And I am here to deliver you a message which is very surprising. You will not believe it, I know. You cannot believe it, I know. I am here to tell you something which is absolutely unbelievable, that you are gods and goddesses. You have forgotten it. Let me tell you one anecdote. Harvey Firestone, Thomas A. Edison, John Burroughs, and Henry Ford stopped at a rural service station on their way to Florida for the winter. We want some bulbs for our headlights, said Ford. And by the way, that is Thomas Edison sitting there in the car, and I am Henry Ford. The fellow at the service station did not even look up, just spat out some tobacco juice with obvious contempt and said, "Ford, we would like to buy a new tire if you have any Firestone tires." And that other fellow in the car is Harvey Firestone himself. Still the old fellow said nothing. While he was placing the tire on the wheel, John Burroughs, with his long white beard, stuck his head out the window and said, "How do you do, stranger?" Finally, the old man at the service station came alive. He glared at Burroughs and said, "If you tell me you are Santa Claus, I will be damned if I don't crush your skull with this lug wrench." He could not believe that in one car, Harvey Firestone, Thomas A. Edison, John Burroughs, and Henry Ford all are traveling. They were all friends. They used to travel together. When I say to you, you are gods and goddesses, you will not believe me, because you have completely forgotten who is traveling within you, who is sitting within you, who is listening to me, who is looking at me. You have completely forgotten. You have been given some labels from the outside and you have trusted those labels. Your name, your religion, your country, all bogus. Because it does not make any sense whether you are a Hindu or a Christian or a Mohammedan. If you don't know yourself, these labels make no sense at all. Maybe they are of a certain utility. What sense does it make whether you are a Hindu or a Christian or a Mohammedan or an Indian, an American, Chinese? How it makes sense, how it helps you to know your being, all irrelevant. Because the being is neither Indian, nor Chinese, nor American. And the being is neither Hindu, nor Mohammedan, nor Christian. The being is simply a pure isness. The pure isness is what I call God. If you can understand your inner divinity, you have understood what life is. Otherwise, you have not been able yet to decode life. This is the message. The whole life is pointing at one thing continuously, that you are God's. Once you have understood it, then there is no death. Then you have learned the lesson. Then in death, gods will be returning back to their homes. When Rabbi Burnham lay dying, his wife burst into tears. He said, "What are you crying for? My whole life was only that I might learn how to die." The whole life, just a training, how to go back home, how to die, how to disappear. Because the moment you disappear, God appears in you. Your presence is God's absence. Your absence is God's presence. Enough for today.